Okay, hello. It is really good to be here. I'm Rachel. I'm your speaker for this session, which is going to cover things about layout and reading order. I'm a white woman in her late 40s. I've got cropped hair. I've got some Lego behind me. I'm in my home office, and I've got a big microphone in front of me that has way too much cat hair on it. All the cats have been chased out of the office, though, for this talk. So I'm a web old timer. I started building sites in 1996. And these days, I'm content lead for Chrome DevRel, and we publish content to web.dev and developer.chrome.com. I also help lead the Baseline project. I'm a CSS Working Group member, and you can find my blog at rachelandrew.co.uk. And I'm especially excited to be here today because I'm going to talk about something that I covered at this conference before. And that's the problem of flex and grid layouts disconnecting the tab order from what can be seen on the screen. But this time, instead of just sharing my kind of hopes and ideas, I've actually got news because we've got a specification and an implementation in Chrome Canary. So we're solving a problem that I've been poking at since the early days of grid layout and Flexbox, and I really hope you'll be as excited as I am to see this happening. So to grid. I've been going on about grid for about 13 years at this point, and one of the first articles I wrote about it was for 24 Ways in December 2012. That article was based on the original IE10 implementation. It was very different from what actually ended up in browsers, and it's quite interesting to see how the spec evolved. But in that article, I suggested to do something with grid that turned out to be a real problem. That article was all about using grid to reorder content at different breakpoints, so moving away from being tied to the source order, so you could give it an optimal visual experience at different breakpoints. Now, that would be fine for screen reader users because they would still get the source in a logical order. But in my enthusiasm, I forgot about the class of users who can see the screen, but are navigating around by tabbing from item to item. And I actually became one of those users later when I damaged my elbow. And so I'm pretty much a one-handed computer user a lot of the time. So it actually was 5 years after that article that Grid finally landed in Chrome, and then Firefox and Safari almost simultaneously in 2017. It's been classed as baseline widely available since January 2023. And I fairly quickly realized those problems with reordering, in fact, long before it shipped in all the browsers. And the slide on screen is from my 2015 talk at CSS Day. And here I was talking about subgrid. Subgrid was part of the initial spec and it was removed. And I was really worried that without subgrid, people would start to remove markup in order to flatten out the grid and make it much easier for them to lay things out. So to me at that point, subgrid was a missing feature that was making grid less accessible. Because Flexbox and Grid dealt with one of these really tricky problems that we'd always had in web design, the fact that we didn't know how tall things were. With Flexbox and Grid, it allowed you to line things up that were participating in the same layout. But those things just had to be a direct child of the grid container. Now, the reason everyone who talks about subgrid will show the same example with cards is because it's a really great and simple demonstration of what subgrid solves. So here we have our 3 cards with footers that don't line up. Each card is a grid layout nested inside a grid which displays the card. And when you highlight the card, you can see that the footers, if a footer has got more text, it kind of pushes the footer up and they don't line up across the cards. And that's something that designers would say, hey, we'd like all those footers to line up and look neat. Now, by using subgrid, you can cause each card to span 2 rows of the parent grid. And that means that the grid template rows on each card is a subgrid, and each footer is actually in the same row, and so they line up. And that was the thing that subgrid solved. And thankfully, it did land eventually. Chrome was the final browser to support that. The work there was done by the Edge team, and it was part of the Interop 2023 effort, making it now baseline newly available. So subgrid is one of these puzzle pieces with grid, something that by having it, it prevented a problem. It prevented people from doing something which could be problematic, and that is removing markup in order to make things line up nicely. And these puzzle pieces typically really interest me about CSS. What are we missing that lets us do more things with the specifications we already have and also prevents kind of bad things happening? Prevents people from going into things which could cause them problems. And the thing I'm going to talk about today is one of those things, this property that we're calling reading flow. It solves a problem, but it also enables things that are currently technically possible, but advised against. So let me show you how that works. So if you're using grid layout, you essentially have two different ways to use grid. You can carefully place your items on a predefined layout. So you've decided your grid layout and you're putting your items into spaces. We also have methods where grid decides where to place items with auto placement. Now, auto placement by default will keep things in the order that they are in the source. So grid doesn't do anything by default to take items and kind of jumble them up. But it gives you a way to do that. If you use grid autoflow dense, grid will backfill gaps left in the layout. So once you get a larger item, and grid has to leave a gap because it can't put it into a small cell, if it then finds a smaller item, it can pick it up and move it back into the layout to fill the gaps. Now, if you're using that jumping around isn't something that you as the developer can actually control. If you've got, layout changes at different breakpoints, you might find that jumping around happens differently. Grid autoflow dense isn't used so much, but if you've been following the debate about CSS masonry, that will do exactly the same sort of thing. And masonry layouts are far more compelling than dense packed grid layouts. So this is a very, very simple masonry layout. And you can see I've got numbers on each of the cards, and essentially you're sort of jumping around between the cards. Now, if that mattered, if the order of those things mattered, that could create a very odd layout. Now, automatic layout methods are problematic because you as the developer actually can't do anything about it if they display in a random kind of order. But there's also, as in that article I showed at the beginning, there's also reasons why you as the developer might have a very good reason to sometimes move things out of the order that they are in the source. There are reasons for that. There's not huge numbers of them. It's not something you're probably going to do all the time. But there are use cases where at some breakpoints you want to prioritize a certain thing and so on. So as I was showing people grid, and even before it actually landed in browsers and I pointed out these problems, it was a bit like I was saying to people, hey, here's a really cool thing. You can, use grid to move things around if necessary, but you can't use it because it causes these problems. It can cause this disconnected experience for anyone who is tabbing around, anyone who can see the layout and also is moving around it, without a mouse. Now, the grid spec tells us we shouldn't do this. It says that grid placement should not be used as a substitute for correct source ordering, which is exactly right. But it doesn't really describe the problems of this visual and source order disconnect that can accidentally happen or happen because of the way that you're using grid. It kind of assumes that all reordering is a mistake or are people using the spec incorrectly. And over time, we found that actually there were these use cases where people did want to move things around. And I think this really goes back to one of the things that we talked about a lot in the early days of CSS layout. When we moved away from using tables for layout and sort of breaking up all our content in tables, we talked about separating content and source from presentation. That's what the CSS Zen Garden was all about. It was showing how you could create completely different designs from the same markup. But in reality, we've never really been able to do that, not with layout anyway. If you create a layout in any way that moves elements away from the order they display in the source, any keyboard user navigating around the document or having the content read out while they can see it on the screen is going to have a strange disconnected experience between what they can see and what they jump to or hear read out. Now, this has been raised with me since the early days of talking about grid. Almost 6 years ago, I wrote a blog post explaining the problems that people were having and the real use cases that people had for doing this kind of reordering. As I mentioned, the masonry discussion very much relates to this. Issues have been raised about masonry because it can cause a very similar problem. It tends to happen a lot when you've got very large items mixed with very small items. You get this kind of strange behavior. Now, for a little while, Firefox actually did attempt to follow the visual order in Flexbox, so just where the order property was concerned. Now, this was a bug because obviously it was a very bad thing that one browser was following the order property and other browsers weren't, and it was fixed. But some people did call for that to be standardized. This is an article from Leone, who obviously knows a huge amount about accessibility and talks about these subjects, saying that, well, maybe we should all be following the Firefox method. So that's kind of the problem. It's a long-standing problem. It's something that we introduced with Grid and Flexbox and the fact that we can do reordering. And it's really exciting to be coming close to a solution at this point. And so this is this property called reading flow. It's being specified in CSS Display 4. It's very much a draft spec. We've had various resolutions in the working group. We're not through resolving every possible issue with this and also in HTML. But there is an experimental implementation in Chrome Canary, and I'll share resources at the end of the talk so you can actually go and try it out. But before I talk about the examples and code, I'm going to talk a little bit of where I started with this and some of the design decisions that went into the draft proposal, because there's been a lot of thought put into this to make sure that we don't actually make the problem worse or cause another class of problems with what we're doing. So every time this came up, it's come up over the years, and I sort of put together a bit of a proposal, and my initial idea was very simple. Well, why don't we just opt into the order things are being laid out? Because we know that in CSS Grid, there's a concept of the grid modified document order, which is the order things are laid out when you're traversing grid cells. So my sort of first idea was, well, why don't we just have a flag and say, follow the grid order? Now, of course, it's never going to be that simple. And this is the nice thing about being in the CSS Working Group, is that you can come along and say, why don't we do this? And someone will immediately say, well, there's a problem with that, and here's why. So maybe we need to do something different. And the real problem was that reading or visual order is actually quite subjective. It matters what the developer's intention was, and we actually can't always tell that from the layout. And it also turned out there's a lot of possibilities. And in fact, Flex is kind of harder than Grid. A good example of this is, what do you want to happen if you use Flex Direction Row Reverse? Now, if you're in a left to right language like English, when you use row reverse, main start and main end are switched to run in the opposite direction to the normal text direction. So that means the items line up from the right and their flow order goes from the right. So in the example on screen, you're going 1, 2, 3, sort of back from the right edge to the left. Now, that might be what you want. Or what you might want is for the reading orders to stay the same, so from left to right, but have the items line up on the right. Now, with things like this, it's actually very hard to know what the developer really wanted when they did that. If you say, follow the order, someone is going to think that we've got it wrong. So we needed to have a way for developers to describe their expectations for reading order. Now, the other thing that was very important was that this had to be a definite choice on a per component basis. What we very much didn't want anyone to be ever able to do is to say, I don't care about the structure of my document. It's a big pile of divs, and then use CSS to arrange it. We really want to avoid people, or probably more likely design tools, using this to avoid updating HTML and just to sort of drag things around. So, for example, if you had a design tool that let you visually create a grid layout, It wouldn't be compliant with the spec. It would be non-conformant if it relied on reading flow to fix how you navigated around that. Instead, you should be updating the source in general. Um, so it's very important that we couldn't do a kind of box sizing border box switch at the top of your CSS and make everything follow reading flow. So one of the things that makes this kind of care possible is that we're scoping this to particular layout contexts. In particular, we're not trying to do this in block layout. And this makes sense anyway. Now, it is possible to jumble things up to some degree with absolute positioning, but you can't really build layouts with absolute positioning to any great degree. And if you were trying to build a layout with absolute positioning, probably the best advice would be to use grid instead, and do the same sort of things. So keeping this scoped to specific layout methods means we can very cleanly define how it behaves in each. The current draft is for grid and flex. If masonry becomes its own thing, we would add keywords to deal with masonry layout. So it's not going to be something that you can just do everywhere. So that's kind of the design decisions that go into how this works and why it works the way that it does. So let's have a look at how this actually works in practice. Now, as I say, the property is called reading flow. It's added to the element that is the flex or grid container. And all of these examples will work in Chrome Canary as long as you've enabled experimental web platform features flags. So the initial value here is normal, and that will do what happens now. So that follows the order of items in the DOM, taking writing mode and direction into account. It ignores things like the order property, grid placement, or anything else that visually moves things around. So we can go back to our flex items. Again, in English, I'm setting them to row reverse. So by default, the tab order starts on the right and moves to the left, and that's following the DOM order. Now, to change this using reading flow, you need to give the reading flow property a value other than normal. So what are the properties, the values for this property that we've got? We've got normal, which is how it normally behaves. We've got flex flow, flex visual, then grid rows, grid columns, and grid order. So using any of those values, a valid value for the layout type that you're in, will cause the container to become a reading flow container, and the items are then ordered based on the value given to the reading flow property. So we'll have a look first at how that works for our reversed flex items. So I've got my example within Flexbox. If I give my flex container a reading flow value of flex visual, the tab order will now follow the visual layout. This means that because we're in a left to right language, the tab order will run from left to right. So our items are still reversed because we've got flex direction row reversed. Item 1 is against the right margin, but reading order is following the visual order of items in English. That means that the third item in the DOM is tab 2 first, then the second, then the first, because we're going in the way that that language works. If I give the flex container a reading flow value of flex flow, it will return to reading from right to left because that's the flow order in this case. So then we're back to 1, 2, 3, reading from the right side first. If I want to make it even more complicated, I could use the order property on one of these items as well as row reverse, because reading flow needs to take into account the modification made by order. So here I've set order to -1 on the third item. And if we remove reading flow or give it a value of normal, that's where you see the disconnected jumping around, because we're not sort of taking order into account. So we do this jumping about. Tabbing still relates to the source order. With reading flow flex visual, we now have that reading order of left to right, taking order into account. So that means that the order we're going is 2, 1, 3. And with reading flow flex flow, we return to the flow. So we work from right to left. But again, we take order into account. So that means that we're going 3, 1, 2. So that's all the possible options for Flexbox. And this works in exactly the same way if you've got a flex direction of column or column reverse, and it works if you're using, say, a vertical writing mode. Um, it's a bit to wrap your head around. As I say, I think Flexbox is actually harder than Grid because of the fact that we do all this sort of reversing and things. As I was building examples, and I built the first set of examples when we didn't have an implementation in the browser. And so I typically think, well, how would this work in terms of the flow and how are we changing that? So that's Flexbox. So let's take a look at how this works with Grid. So at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned how in Grid we've got two kind of things going on. We've got the auto placement situation where Grid places things, and then we've got the situations where we move things about. So let's have a look at auto placement with Grid Autoflow Dense. So by default, Grid takes the source order into account. If you've only got auto-placed items, they'll end up with a reasonable tab order. So in the example on the screen, there are gaps in the layout because the 1 and 2 are very small items, and then 3 is spanning 3 rows, so it doesn't fit on the top line. So it leaves a gap and it moves down. So it leaves empty cells. So that's the default behavior of Grid. And so here the tab order looks fairly sensible because the things are actually laid out pretty much in the order you'd expect. Now, if I use Grid Autoflow Dense, we get a very nicely packed layout. But what's happened here is that we lay out item 1, then item 2, and then because item 3 has moved down to the next row, Grid has found item 4 and 5, they're small, moved them up to the top row. And so then you start to get the jumping around. You can't control that as a developer because it could be different at different breakpoints, depending on your layout. And so this is where it can be quite problematic. And as I say, masonry will be very similar. So with Grid, we've got different keywords because typically what you want to do with Grid is follow the visual order of items by row or by column. So in this case, with our disconnected, dense packed layout, we can use grid rows. And the tab order will then follow the items by row in the rows they've ended up based on the dense packed placement. So this is the previous example with the code, and we've got reading flow grid rows. So this means that the tab order now will go 1, 2, 4, 5, because those are the items in the first row. Then we go to 3, because that's moved down to the next row. And then we'll do 6 and 7, which are next to that. So what we're doing here is we're trying to follow the rows. And obviously, we've got a large item which actually spans 2 rows, but the reading order is roughly, staying in rows by doing that. So then you might want to go down the columns. Again, you could have a densely packed layout and decide that the appropriate order for that to be read out is by column. So in this case, dense packing has essentially ended up with 3 columns. The first column has got 3 items. Then there's a middle column with a big item in it, which spans over several rows and columns. And then there's a third column with 3 items in. And so the grid is sort of tabbing down the first column top to bottom, then the middle column, and then the last column top to bottom. If we were to do this, when we're following DOM order, what we're doing is we're jumping back and forth across the columns, which you can actually see in the animated example. If you can see that, we're sort of hopping over the large item. So by using reading flow grid columns, that tidies up and we get the column reading experience that we were kind of expecting. And I'm aware these examples are very visual and I'm trying my best to describe them, but it's definitely a difficult thing to not fall over. So yes, it's a bit tricky. So anyway, the second thing with grid is obviously you can place items by yourself, and that's probably the most common use of grid. I think this auto-placed issue will become much larger once we have masonry in play. So most people, how they're using grid is they're using line-based placement or grid template areas, and you're creating a layout and you're laying things out. In terms of reading flow, it works in pretty much the same way. You decide if you want to follow rows or columns and use the value to control that. So here is an absolutely terrible example that no one should ever build, but it's just to show you that you can very easily make a mess, with grid template areas and completely jumble up the tab order. So what I've done here is I've got a grid which, the second item in the DOM is right at the top, and then we've got the fourth item, and then the sixth, and the first item is right at the end of the layout. So it's a real jumbly mess. Now, I wouldn't suggest that anyone does anything like that, but if you did and there was a real reason to do it, you could sort that out by saying you wanted reading flow to have a value of grid rows. And in that case, we'd start at the top, we'd read item 2, which is the first item, and then we'd go to item 4, item 6, and then 5, 3, and 1, because that's how they are read out in their rows. There's a final value for reading flow for grid layout, and that's grid order. The reason we've included this is it scoops up a few use cases we might miss with the other possibilities. Now, if you use the grid order value, then any other placement or dense packing will actually be ignored. So things will stay like normal, they'll stay in DOM order, but only the order property will impact on tab order. So this is really if you've got one special thing you want to move around, but everything else you just want to happen as grid would normally flow. So I've got an example here where the second item in the DOM has been given order -1. Therefore, that's been tabbed to first, but the rest of the tab order is just as they are in the DOM. So that scoops up a few use cases that we felt were missed off otherwise. So this was our first sort of where we got to. We got this into Chromium. The work's been done by an engineer D at Chrome. And then as we were working through all the possible scenarios, we came up with some additional scenarios that we didn't think we could quite solve with what we had. And so at the CSS Working Group last month, we resolved to add an additional property for the children of a reading flow container, which is actually called reading order. And this is for situations where you want to change just one item in a masonry or dense packed flow, but you don't want to, for whatever reason, mess around with the order. Where this is likely to come up is in masonry, and so we're trying to get ahead of ourselves. We know that people want masonry. There's some decisions to make about how we're going to actually do masonry in CSS. There's 2 different proposals, but however we do masonry, it starts to raise some extra examples. This is one of them. This is one of the really nice demos that the Safari team made to sort of show how masonry would work. And in this demo, they said, well, actually, it's all laid out with auto placement. It's all laid out with masonry. But what we'd want is people to go to the far right panel first, because in this demo, it's basically an art gallery. So they're all pieces of art. But the very first panel, which is displayed on the right-hand side, has some information that you would want to read first before you looked at all the art pieces and tab to those. And so in this situation, we'd want to go to that one first, but everything else should just follow the masonry flow and then be dealt with by row order probably. So it's going to work in a very similar way to order. So with the order property, what happens is you group things by their ordinal value with a default of 0. So this property will work in very much the same way, but it's only going to affect the order of that one item. It's really going to be in these automatic layout methods where you want to make one item special in terms of reading flow. And that also has just been implemented in Chrome, so you can try that one out in Canary too. So that's really it. That's the demos. It's Relatively simple in use. I think the complexity comes because the underlying layout methods are complex, and we're having to sort of try and work around that. I think Flexbox takes far more wrapping your head around than Grid, because at least in Grid we've always got those two dimensions. We've always got rows and we've got columns. I think in practice, it solves the problems. It solves the use cases that I've collected over the years. I can look down those and go, yep, we could do all of those things. There's no scary box sizing like switch that tells the browser to just treat everything like a big jumbly mess and let you move around. Um, Source order is really important. I don't think that's something I need to stress to this audience. We need to make sure that we have a really solid source and that we're doing layout on top of that. No one should ever be using reading flow to avoid the work of updating your HTML. And I hope that we're adding in enough friction that will stop people kind of accidentally doing that. I think that the majority of use of this, outside of the automatic layout methods, where I think it's just going to be generally very useful to have to decide whether you think it should be read by rows or columns and set it. I think for most people, you will still be creating a document that makes sense without CSS, that will be read out in the order it appears in the DOM. Perhaps that aligns to your mobile layout, perhaps the other way around. And then as you kind of prioritize content in your layout, as you're working on your design at different breakpoints, you might find that there's a real reason to shift an item or two out of source order in terms of how they're navigated to at different breakpoints. And so at that breakpoint, you can add in reading flow just to tweak that use case that you've encountered. I think for most people, this is going to be something that you add probably towards the end of the work that you're doing to improve accessibility and to improve the ordering situation for people who are tabbing around. It's not going to be something that you think, oh, I need to start out with this and build everything around it. So, I'm kind of hoping, I've been working on this for a long time, but I'm kind of hoping that I don't actually see it used that much in a lot of cases, because it's sort of something that there are those use cases that we know exist, but generally we should really be, working to a solid source to start with. So as I say, everything that I've shown so far can be tried out in Chrome Canary with experimental web platform features turned on. If you go to chrome.dev reading flow examples, there's some very, very small examples that you can actually try it out. I'd be very interested in as many different people trying this out as possible. Particularly if you have, specific access needs. If you're listening to this and think, oh, that sounds a bit scary, then you're definitely the person I want to go and try it out and give us feedback. Because the more people we get to test this out at this stage, while it's, in experimental browser, it's behind a flag. It's not out there in the wild yet. We can still raise more issues on it. I would really love people to be trying it out. If you have use cases where you've come up against this very problem and you're like, I'm not sure if this would work, I'd like to see those too, because then I can test them out. I can, see if I can get it to work, or if not, again, that's something that I can take back to the working group and we can see if we can fix it. I often say this when I talk about new things. When you've got something new that's only in an experimental browser, that is the absolute best time to be offering feedback. Once it's got out there onto the web and it's in a browser, it's much harder for us to change things because people might have started using it. So, there's a really good chance now of just, going, having a look and just making sure that we've not missed anything, that we've not ignored some important use case, or we've not caused a potential problem that we should be kind of gating against. So please, please, please try and have a look, or even if you've just got some thoughts about it, let me know. And we'll go to questions now, so you can ask me right away. I will also check out the Discord if you just want to type stuff in there. I'll do that later, or you can always, I'm fairly easy to find online. If you search for Rachel Andrew, I'm very happy to talk about this. So thank you very much for listening.
Awesome. Great job, Rachel. Attendees definitely loved your content. We actually got a few really interesting questions. The first one we'll start with from Dylan is, does the reading flow property change the underlying accessibility tree itself?
No, so the thing that we've had to it won't shouldn't change anything about the accessibility tree and how things are marked up. The thing we've had to be very careful with, there's actually an open PR on the HTML spec for this. It's kind of waiting for making sure everything's sorted out um, with the CSS side, is the interaction obviously between tab index. I mean, generally we advise people against doing things like positive tab indexes and things, but all of that has to be spec'd because obviously this, potentially interacts with that. But everything else, if whatever it's been mocked up as that is then being used, that should all stay the same. And as I say, we are only applying this to things that are in a grid or flex formatting context as well, which gives some sort of safety as well.
Awesome. We had someone ask about browser support for reading flow, and someone actually, just to make sure everyone saw the answer, it's still in draft, it looks like.
Yes, it's
Um,
experimental, as I say, Chrome Canary at the moment, with experimental web platform features on, and then things should work. But yes, it's still, as I say, still early stage really.
cool. On that Chrome Canary note, perfect segue into the next question. Should reading flow also change the arrow key navigation order for a group of radio buttons? At the moment in Chrome Canary, it doesn't seem to.
That is an interesting one because that's a different. I mean, you'd have to have them laid out with grid or flex, I guess. Um, that's an interesting one. That's something we could bring up. Um, yes, I'll look into that. I don't think it would at the moment, no. But yeah, I think yeah, that's not something I have looked into. So, if anyone has an actual has a good example of that where they've laid those things out with grid or flex, that would be super useful too.
Yeah, if you find something, post it in Discord later. Super interesting. Um, the next question, sorry, is there guidance for how a roving tab index technique can be used in JavaScript with reading flow in mind? For example, a tabs pattern where the tabs use a flex layout and wrap reverse.
That would be a really good thing to build, actually. Um, Again, if you've got examples that you'd like me to have a go at, then yeah, stick them in there because I think I'd like to build some more complex examples. Now we've kind of got this into a state where they would work. Um, so yeah, that sort of example. I think any kind of complex navigation-y thing where there is a legitimate reason for you to be reordering stuff. I think one of the things is people tend to when you sort of say, "Oh, give us feedback on this thing," people think of very complicated scenarios and kind of like, yes, that would be a problem, but is that actually happening out there on the web? And so, what I do want to identify is where there are those things that people are doing um, legitimately, and does it work for them? Um, rather than theoretical things. So if you've got examples, whether they're yours or you've seen them on a website and you thought this is terrible to use, and you think this would solve it, I'd love to see those, and then I can have a go at rebuilding them.
All right, we got time for one last quick question, I think, and it's probably a tough one to answer. When do you expect this will make it to the major browsers?
I mean, really, there's a couple of open issues on the spec that we're just trying to get resolved. I think assuming we don't, come up with anything terrible, we could have it in Chrome relatively soon. And then it's the case of as with any new thing in CSS or what have you, it's getting that then scheduled to be implemented in other browsers. Obviously, this has been worked on in the CSS Working Group with the people from other browsers. It won't be resolved. Things that need resolving have to be resolved by all of us, to go through. So generally, if things are resolved upon in CSS and they make it into a spec, other browsers are happy with them. But then it's just getting priorities in place to get them implemented. Obviously, this is something that is most useful when it's available everywhere. I would love it to be available by the time Masonry is available across browser. That's kind of my hope, is that we have this for Masonry, because I think Masonry is going to cause this problem quite significantly. So that's kind of my hope, and is why I've been sort of really leaning on it. But it's obviously down to priorities at browsers, as with everything else. But fingers crossed, and hopefully we'll get it into Chrome fairly soon, so people can actually start, really using it.
Awesome. Actually, we got a couple new questions coming in and we do have time, so
Cool.
we'll go with a couple more. So I imagine this question is kind of talking about the direction of reading based on language. So does this property work seamlessly for Arabic?
Yes, it should. Yeah, I mean, because the nice thing with Grid and Flexbox is they were designed to take into account reading order, the actual order of the language and the script. So things like vertical writing modes, Arabic, and so on. So yes, they should all work. In my brief test, they seem to have been working fine in terms of the implementation. If they don't, it's a bug, because we should be following the flow of the language. In terms of both RTL languages and also vertical languages.
Awesome. And last one is pretty open for you. What are the challenges you have come across while building this fantastic feature?
I think it's getting things prioritized is always a really interesting thing with working on CSS. As I say, I identified this as a problem before Grid shipped in browsers, and I started talking about it. Um, and it tends to involve, I think, lots of things coming together. I think the masonry becoming something that people wanted helped to prioritize this as an idea, because it was, an automatic layout method that was going to create this problem. I think there's a bunch of people who, when I brought this up, would say, well, people should just follow source order, stop jumbling up your layouts. And so, so part of, I guess, my job as trying to push this through was finding the examples that were legitimate, that weren't just people forgetting about their source order and saying, actually, we're not supporting something that people need to do. So yeah, I think that's the challenges tend to be just that, browsers are small teams, have got lots of, infinite numbers of things they could be doing, and just trying to, get something through and get something into development, get because you can write as many specs as you want. If no one's willing to implement it, it's completely useless. So I think that's usually the challenge. And I don't know, having done this for a long time, things just come together. It's like suddenly, like you'll see, like suddenly a whole bunch of stuff happens in CSS. It's like, where did all that come from? And then you realize actually it's been talked about for years. It's got to the right time. The needs are correct. The browsers are aligned, because it seems like something that everybody wants. So yeah, I think you just have to be kind of patient with this stuff and keep on working on it.
Awesome. Yeah, just to reiterate, if you have cool, interesting examples that would help the working group work through some of these problems, it sounds like they are very open to you sharing those.
Yeah, I'd love to see anything that you think this might help with, or anything that might be dangerous. Let me have a look at it, because I'd love to see it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rachel. Amazing session. I think that's all the time we have, and we're out of questions. So thanks for